Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to our online seminar with the title Social Protest and Human Rights. The Honorable Vice Rector of Pattimura University, the Head and Secretary of Pattimura University, Senate, our speaker, Professor Fridus Steijlen, Professor Tony Pariella, Dean of Social Science and Politics, Dr. Rory Akuen, Dean of Law Faculty, and all guests of this online seminar. Peace to all of. I would like to thank to the head of staff of the International Office of Pattimura University who has arranged this meeting. Must say that this online seminar is very important and should be held regularly in order to extend our knowledge either from academic of Pattimura University or other in Indonesia. Ladies and gentlemen, later the world community was busy discussing the issue of racism that began with the killing of US citizens George Floyd. This conversation also spread throughout the country, including comparing the situation of racists in Indonesia. In fact, racist problems have long occurred in part of the world, especially in Indonesia. More precisely, when the Dutch began to establish power in Indonesia. It continued during the Indonesian Revolution and so on until now. There are two important things to see how racism is regulated in the content of human rights. First, to measure whether of the state effectively punishes racial and ethnic discrimination. Second, how effective the country is in preventing it. Today we hold a seminar about social protest and human rights. I hope the seminar can be useful for development of our knowledge going forward. And hopefully the collaboration between Pattimura University and Vrije University can work together to develop the two universities to be better in the future. Thank you also to all the participants who have participated. May God bless all of us. Finally, by giving thanks to the Almighty, and I officially open this seminar. Thank you, peace, and all of us. Thank you very much. And this Mr.
Thank you, Prof. Safteno. Dear audience, we turn into our main agenda, the presentation by three speakers, and this session will be guided by moderator Maria Agnes Matakena, students of Faculty of Law, Pattimura University. To Agnes, please, the time is yours.
Thank you, Ms. Wilma, for that introduction. Hello, everyone. It's an honor for me to be your moderator for today's webinar. Before we introduce and welcome our awaited speakers, allow me to give a brief rundown for today's webinar, as well as introduce some ground rules so that our discussion today runs smoothly. For today's rundown, which you can see on the screen, firstly, we've already had the opening ceremony led by Ms. Wilma. After that, we will enter right into our presentation session. During this panel session, we will have three presentations delivered by three esteemed speakers, whom we will introduce very soon. This will then be followed by a question and answer session. And after that, a very exciting ice-breaking session led by the Pattimura University International Office staff. To close today's discussion, we will ask the speakers to give a brief conclusion on today's topic before having a photo session with the speakers and participants. After that, I will hand over the webinar to Ms. Wilma so that she can lead the closing ceremony. So after that, I'd like to read some ground rules. We ask that the participants pay close attention to these rules so that our webinar can run smoothly. So it might seem a lot. We have 12 ground rules, but they're all very simple. Firstly, we ask that the participants should use their registration name as their Zoom account. Secondly, the webinar's agenda, if you open your emails, will be found as an attachment. And we ask that the participants change the names of their Zoom, their display names, as the format shows on screen. So first of all, you have your name, _, institution. So for example, we have Arnold _ Vrije University. Thirdly, we ask that the participants should join the meeting room before 15 minutes, which you all have, so thank you. Fourthly, we ask that the participants do not share this link with others, as this is a very coveted webinar and many people are vying for a position, for a spot on this webinar, so we have to keep it limited. Fifth, we'd ask that the participants should mute their microphone and turn on their video during the webinar as a show of respect for our speakers today. Next, we ask that the participants also do not share their screen at all during the webinar. Seventh, we will have an attendance list that will be shared via the chat room feature after 60 minutes. Eighth, during the presentation, should the participants have any questions or queries, we ask that the participants share those questions via the chat room feature. And we have a particular format that is as follows on screen. So you would have your name, _ your institution, and then _ your question. So for example, Arnold, Vrije University, how to conduct a safe protest in the pandemic. We will also allow the questions to either be in Indonesian or in English. 10th, we have that the participants are not to write anything outside the presentation material. We also ask that the participants keep their language appropriate and do not have any offensive comments or statements. 11th, we ask that the participants do comply with these regulations being set by the committee. For any participant that is found to violate these rules, we unfortunately will have to remove you from the meeting room. And lastly, every participant is eligible for an e-certificate, but it will be given to those who are or who input the absence or the roll call that we will share via link 60 minutes into the webinar. So that's our rundown and our guidelines for today. So without further ado, it is my honor to introduce our first speaker of today's webinar, which is Professor Fridus Steijlen. Professor Steijlen is a senior researcher in a government-sponsored research project on the history of Moluccans in the Netherlands, coordinated by the Moluccan Museum in Utrecht. Professor Steijlen studied anthropology with a specialization in Indonesia and ethnic minorities, especially Moluccans in the Netherlands, at the University of Amsterdam. In 1996, he obtained his PhD at the University of Amsterdam with a doctoral thesis on the history of Moluccan nationalism in the Netherlands. On the 17th of June 2017, he was appointed as an endowed professor of Moluccan migration and culture in comparative perspective at the Vrije Universiteit Amsterdam. This chair was established by the foundation of the Moluccan Historical Museum. So we remind our esteemed speaker that you will be given 20 minutes to deliver your presentation. And when you have 5 minutes left, I will notify you of the time. So with that, we invite Professor Steijlen to deliver his presentation. The time is yours, Professor.
Thank you for introducing. Selamat sore to everybody in Maluku and selamat pagi to everybody in the Netherlands. First of all, I would like to thank Pattimura to invite me for this webinar. And I feel honored that Rector Pa Tony and Pa Rory has welcomed me in their midst. And I'm sure many of my esteemed colleagues in Maluku, I just saw them in the webinar. I see this webinar as a first joint event in the framework of the recently signed MOU between UNPATI and the Vrije University, and I hope that many will follow. Having said that, my dear audience, let me turn to my talk. I give this talk the title Coen Did It Again. And what I did not refer with this title to the mass killings on Banda in 1621, but in fact I refer to the statue of Jan Pieterszoon Coen, this is his full name, in the small Dutch village of Horen, and that again attracted protesters who are concerned about racism in the Netherlands and its colonial past. Several times earlier, the statue was surrounded with protests, this time against the background of the Black Lives Matter movement that came ashore in Europe and the Netherlands in the month of May after the Black Lives Matter movement protests in the United States grew as a reaction to the death of George Floyd by the police violence on the 25th of May 2020. So in my talk, I'm going to take you with me to the Netherlands. Why would that be of any relevance or interest to people in Maluku? I think it's interesting because part of the protesters are descendants of Moluccans now living in the Netherlands, and because the debate on Dutch colonialism is very much related to the spice trade in Maluku. And as we will see, it is symbolized through J.P. Coen, and I hope that you will feel the same after my talk. J.P. Coen, the man and the statue. It seems a bit odd to explain an audience with a majority of Moluccans who J.P. Coen was. But let me do it as a reminder for those of you who don't have him clear on their minds, and maybe because of some of the Dutch audience who didn't learn at school so very much about what J.P. Coen exactly did. Coen was born on the 8th of January 1587 in the city of Horen, some 35 kilometers north of Amsterdam. Horen was one of the cities that was represented in the VOC, the United East Indies Company, that was striving for monopoly in the spice trade with Indonesia, and more specifically, Maluku. The first prize were the cloves that grew on the Moluccas and the nutmeg that only grew on the island of Banda. J.P. Coen started as a sub-merchant for the VOC in 1607. These were the starting years of the VOC, while it was still establishing its network in the Indonesian archipelago, competing with the English and with the Portuguese. In 1618, he became the Governor General of the VOC in Indonesia. He was the highest representative of the VOC. And as a Governor General, he started to build the new central settlements on Java, which later became Batavia and Jakarta. When Coen learned that the people of Banda did not live according to the agreements about nutmeg delivery to the VOC that the VOC had imposed on them, but they also traded with the English, Coen departed to Banda in 1621 with a strongly armed fleet. Because the Bandese refused to obey the VOC, Coen attacked the population, killing the Orang Kaya, making many thousands flee and other prisoners. The result was the emptied islands, which he then divided in plantations, perken, as they were called, and they were given to maintenance to perkeniers, who were also provided by forced laborers. Although at that time already his deeds were seen as cruel and criticized, the VOC gladly benefited by it. We nowadays see this massacre as the symbol of violent colonialism and the proof of Dutch slavery and forced labor in the Indonesian archipelago. Let me then take you at an almost 300 years jump in time to 1887. Maybe just to point at one of the pictures at the left, the painting. It's a picture in the collection of the Moluccan Historical Museum in the Netherlands, but I think it's a painting from Siwa Lima, where we see the massacre on the Banda Islands. But okay, let me take you a 300 years jump in time to 1887. It's the 300th anniversary of Coen's birthday. It was a period in which, according to historians, the fever of nationalism ran through the Netherlands, resulting in many statues of so-called important figures of Dutch history. In 1884, a teacher in Hoorn suggested that the city of Hoorn should erect a statue for J.P. Coen on his coming birthday in 1887. The project was too large for Hoorn, and it became a national project. At least 135 people from different Dutch provinces joined the committee that organized and funded the funding and the design of the statue, which then finally was erected in the center of the city in 1893, in front of the then already existing regional West-Fries Museum. And in the middle of the slide, you see a picture of the statue that I take. It's a snippet from a newspaper in 1928. It's a contested figure and it's a contested statue. The person of J.P. Coen and his statue were regular subjects of discussion and contestation, also by Moluccans who live in the Netherlands. One of these movements that received broad exposure in national media, as you can see on the right, and I will explain this picture later, was in 1987, 400 years after Coen's birth. The West-Fries Museum in Hoorn had declared that the year the J.P. Coen year. The director at that time, Ruud Spruit, you see him on the other picture, who had invited Willy Nalohi, a Moluccan artist, to exhibit his work in the basement of the museum as part of a wider exhibition about Coen. While installing his sculptures, Willy Nalohi discovers that Coen was being glorified in the other halls of the museum. And because of the same J.P. Coen was responsible for the bloody enforcement of the VOC monopoly in nutmeg trade on Banda, for him being part of the Moluccas where his family comes from. He felt misused and in protest he covered his sculptures with black mourning cloths. At the official opening of the exhibition, which was attended by Prince Claus, and we see at the right, the husband of the then Queen Beatrix, Willy left his chair next to him empty for the spirit of his grandfather, who had served in the Royal Dutch East Indies armies, the KNIL. During the opening ceremony, Willy Nalohi, dressed as a Moluccan warrior, stood up and offered Prince Claus a black book about Moluccan history. Museum director Spruit was furious and ordered for the cloths to be removed from Willy's sculptures. And in order to end this act of protest in a way that was satisfying to him, Willy then decided at the end, after a year, to burn the cloths while seeking contact with his ancestors through the performance of a chakalilla. And the most logical place for that was the Moluccan ward in Camp in Vught, in the southern part of the Netherlands. The protest by Willy Nalohi was supported by a large group of Moluccans. Their protest concerned existing racism and discrimination in the Netherlands and the ignorance and lack of knowledge about the colonial history and exploitation of Moluccans and Maluku by the Dutch. Coen figured as a symbol of colonial oppression and his statue as a rally point for protests. It was a time where a lot of Moluccans were involved in anti-racist movements that were going on in the Netherlands until the 1990s. And somewhere at the beginning of this century, this movement started to be more silenced. J.P. Coen's statue was kicked off the pedestal in 2011 by coincidence when a truck was moving on the square of Doorn, and then followed the discussion whether or not the statue had to be re-erected, and this turned into a yes. They gave voice to the critic on Coen by a small plaquette that's put on the feet of the pedestal, explaining the black pages of Coen's history, and the West-Fries Museum organized a kind of tribunal in which the visitors of the museum and bypassers could express their verdict about Coen. Now I go to the protest against Coen as a part of the Black Lives Matter movement. There was a most recent protest with the statue of J.P. Coen in Hoorn as a rally point was on the 19th of June. Within the context of the Black Lives Matter movement in the Netherlands. 3 organizations, the Molukken Building the Baleo, the Decolonization Network Former Netherlands East Indies, and We Promise, called for a peaceful demonstration under the slogan J.P. Coen has to go. In earlier demonstrations in the United States and the United Kingdom, statues were attacked by BLM protesters, and even some were taken down. Like the statue, for example, the statue of slave trader Edward Golson on the 7th of June in Bristol in the United Kingdom. It was feared that Coen would undergo the same fate, and to make sure that the demonstrators would not harm the statue and would not hinder the people enjoying the summer in the center of the city of Hoorn, the local government directed the demonstration to a parking lot. A couple of hundred demonstrators show up. Close by, there was another demonstration attracting 20 to 25 people, and it was held in favor of J.P. Coen. The right picture, you see a picture of the demonstration, and there is this central slogan, decolonize, and I will come back to this later. The protest at Coen echoed the colonialism and oppression in the Molukkers, like the rallies in 1980s. The strength of a protest at Coen's statue is that it refers to the spice trade, and especially the trade of nutmeg as the start of Dutch colonialism. And it refers to the oppression and violence exercised by the VOC and the suffering of the Molukkans. This efficiently brings the protest home to the Netherlands because of the presence of a Molukkan community in the Netherlands. And in that sense, the figure and statue of Coen is a stronger rally point than statues of other colonial figures, like Generaal van Heuts, that's the other picture, who is considered to be the butcher of Aceh because he was the architect of the subjection of Aceh. His contribution to the Dutch colonialism was at the end of the colonial expansion, which makes him less attractive. But there's another point. His statues are less impressive in terms of statue language. The Adriaanse van Heuts monument that we see at the left is reframed and refurnished as the Netherlands-Indonesia monument. And there is a statue in Koevoorden and it's a small bust. In fact, it's in the contrary of the intimidating statue of Coen towering above the square on a pedestal, forcing the bypassers to look up and feel humble and feel the pride of Coen and those who celebrate him on his deeds. Or in the words of Ad Geerdink, the director of the West-Fries Museum, on the website of the museum in a video clip explaining the statue, he explains that the statue figures Coen slightly bent in the back so that he leans on his left hind leg and stands with the chest forward and therefore appears more powerful. The statue seems to radiate the "don't fuck with Coen" and the VOC, and that effect is further enhanced by the cannon at his feet. And of course, it's a statue where for the real spot for Molukkans to express their connection to what happened in the past. The BLM demands and colonialism. The reference to colonialism in the protest of Coen's statue is just one aspect of the whole debate that the BLM movement evokes in the Netherlands. The demands are broader than just recognition and rejection of, for example, the massacre at Banda by Coen. The movement goes further and talks about present-day institutional racism, the practices of daily discrimination because of ethnicity or color that is experienced by people of color in the Netherlands. There is a connection between institutional racism and colonialism. In her book, The White Innocence, that deals with, among other institutional racism in the Netherlands, Gloria Wekker, a Dutch pseudonymous scholar, borrows the concept of cultural archive from Edward Said. The cultural archive is, in short, the hidden historical experiences in our minds or in the minds of our society that determines the way we shape present-day relations. A colonial history from the perspective of the powerful, from the upper layers of colonial society, combined with the discourses on race, differences, or white supremacy, in other words, resonate in the present and creates inequality based on color and ethnicity. And the demand of the BLM is therefore to face the mistakes, crimes, injustice, and inequality of colonialism and, of course, slavery for the sake of history and to overcome present-day institutional racism and inequalities. There are some similarities between the demands that were raised in the 1980s and the present demands by the BLM movement. but the demands are now stronger voiced than and more pressing. Like I observed this in four reasons why this is. The first is that the demands in the 1980s, and the two covers of the monthly Chinke, referring to discrimination back then, there were more, and it's simply formulated like a request. Protesters were still prepared for a march through the institutions to make changes happen. The present generation does not want such a march. They demand that their society has to change. The present generation, more than the generation of the 1980s, claims Dutch society as theirs, and that they therefore have the right to demand and not to ask for a change. The second observation is that the new BLM demands in the Netherlands are built up earlier demands to change Dutch society. There's some debate about Zwarte Piet, Black Piet, as a colored servant of the White Bosque Sinterklaas, who appears every December as a part of a children's event. The figure as Black Piet is a case of blackface, and thanks to the steadfast of the protesters, is the attitude towards the blackface figure slowly changing. In the beginning, the debate was very much about a supposed innocent Dutch tradition, and slowly the pain and offenses people of color in the Netherlands experience because of the blackface character come to the fore. And in a way, the BLM benefits from this debate and the growing space to acknowledge the pain and perspectives of people of color. A third observation with the strong sounding of the demands is that they are raised from an international platform. BLM process as a reaction to the death of George Floyd in May expanded very fast to the former colonizing countries like the UK and the Netherlands, adding new demands about addressing colonial past and how this past still affects the present day of the European countries. This international dimension underlines the seriousness of the protest, and it shows that it's not just a Dutch issue, but a larger of former colonial powers. And here we see John Lewis, who recently passed away, one of the last surviving freedom riders from the United States. And then there's this fourth observation, and it's the COVID factor. The last factor that I observed as strengthening the voice of the movement is the protest emerges in COVID times. The massive protests started more or less at the same time the lockdown regulations in the Netherlands were getting looser. The first BLM meeting at the Dam Square in Amsterdam, we see at the upright in the Parool clipping, was on Monday, the 1st of June, a holiday and the first day that people were allowed to come together in open air, as long as they respected 1.5 meter distance, social distancing, as we say. Some 100% protesters were expected, but 10,000 showed up, not being able to keep the 1.5 meter distance. There was a heavy press covering, also because there were less other events, but most of the reports were about health risks and that the meeting and why the meeting was not forbidden or shortcut by the local authorities. And as a reaction to this press coverage, the debate emerged with why the media was more interested in health issues than in the real problem, institutional racism in the Netherlands. The claim to start talking about the real issue was supported by new demonstrations in cities all over the country. And to make sure that the focus was in the central issue and not on these health issues, the organizers made sure that the demonstrations should meet the social distancing rules. And then this became a strength. At least it gave a better insight in what the motives of the protesters were. TV reporters on the largest meeting in Southeast Amsterdam, where 15,000 people gathered on the 10th of June, could walk between the lines of protesters, as you can see on the screenshot from a local television, RT5. They could walk between the lines of the protesters, whom many of them carried a sign with slogans, general slogans, but also personal slogans. And the picture and all the small reports made the protest more personal and therefore more intense. And the many numbers of protesters standing at 1.5 meter distance made the meeting at the same time much more massive. So this is a part of also strengthening the voice of the protest. But now, how further? I think the renewed protest in the wake of the BLM may take the Netherlands to a next level. The momentum was strong. The demands were expressed stronger and more urgent this time compared with earlier years. It seems that institutional racism, the colonial past and slavery, and its relations are on the public agenda at least for the coming time. But how about J.P. Coen? He will remain the symbol of violent colonialism, and he will remind us of the early years of Dutch colonialism, that in the early years of Dutch colonialism, Maluku played a central role. Or to put it more cynical, the Moluccas were a faraway arena where colonial powers, neighbors in Europe, fought over the spice market. How about his statue? And that showed to be an excellent rally point for protesters. Should it be taken out of the public domain into a museum? Some say yes, others think that the statue should stay in the public domain to stimulate discussion. It depends on how you want to approach this history. We rewrite history books, changing and updating emphases and perspectives. We change the windows through which we want to look at the history. And every window has one or two figureheads as an interest. So the discussion is about which figurehead we want to use for our windows. The impact of a figurehead is that we will remember the big figurehead more and then what is behind the window, more than the nuances and the broader stories of the window. And what is the impact of J.P. Coen's statue in front of the West-Fries Museum? When it wants to tell a critical story, Coen will still be the figurehead in the front. And the first message of such an image is that the museum celebrates that person. The museum and the city of Hoorn are going to discuss how to deal with J.P. Coen in the public domain. The museum is going to meet some critical minds about Coen, among them young Moluccans in the Netherlands. And the city wants to have a city meeting with people from Hoorn. Coen's statue is, however, not just something only from Hoorn. The initiative to erect it was a national one, and Coen represents a black page in Dutch history and not just that of Hoorn. Moreover, J.P. Coen is also linked to the history of Maluku and Moluccans. Maybe it would be a good idea to involve those who suffered from Coen in the discussion, how to deal with his legacy and his statue. Wouldn't it be a kind of reconciliation or acknowledgement when Moluccans in the Netherlands, but also descendants of Banda, and for example, scholars from Maluku, from Universiteit Pattimura, join in that discussion? Next year will be a good opportunity. In 2021, it's 400 years ago that J.P. Coen sailed to Banda to violently enforce the VOC monopoly on nutmeg trade. Thank you for your...
Thank you very much, Professor Steijlen, for such an insightful and eye-opening presentation. We would like to continue on to our second speaker for today. I'd like to introduce Professor Tony Pariela, who is the Dean of the Faculty of Social and Political Sciences at Pattimura University. He is an expert in the field of social and political sciences, and he is actively producing books and conducting several research and actively involved in seminar and workshop as keynote speaker for community dedication. We would like to remind Professor Tony that he will have 20 minutes to present, and 5 minutes before the allotted time is concluded, I will notify you. So without further ado, I invite Professor Pariela to deliver his presentation. Time is yours, Professor.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. The Honorable Rector of Pattimura University, Professor Sabteno, my colleague speakers, Professor Fridus and Dr. Akiwen, ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon to all participants. Honestly, when I was invited to talk about in this seminar or webinar, I was thinking about what Professor Fridus will going to talk about. And lucky me, I got his abstract, explain what he might address his speech in today's webinar. So I decided to talk about what I call understanding through the eyes of protesters, social disobedience, in the middle of pandemic disease, COVID-19, of course, in Ambon. So I chose this topic intentionally with the hope that what have been happening at the global level, we might be able to have a comprehensive understanding about what had been happening in the global level as well as in the local level. I mean, in fact, that many demonstrations or protest movement happened because of the death case of George Floyd, especially in the global level. But at the same time, demonstration was also happened at the local level with different background and of course different causes as well. The question is where the intersection for both global and local cases. I think this is my point that will be addressed and discussed on today's webinar. Ladies and gentlemen, in accordance with what was delivered by Professor Fridus, my paper was also inspired by the death case of George Floyd in America. As we all know, that, sorry. Yeah. As we all know that the death case has triggered a huge demonstration or protest movement all over the world. This is not, for me, of course, this is not merely an issue of demonstration itself that used to be taking place in normal situation. This is a serious social problem because the demonstration was happened in the middle of pandemic situation that was very dangerous for the safety of human life. You can imagine that when people are advised to not assemble or not crowd around in terms of any interest, on the contrary, we might see that was a mass crowd mainly to voice protest over the death of George Floyd, especially in the US, including in the Netherlands, of course. The protest as we noted, is related to racism, discrimination, and injustice for Blacks, primarily in the States. So the reality then triggers a common consciousness almost all over the world, evoking a sense of, let's say, solidarity, because it could be possible that they have the same bad experience in their own country, regardless the substance of the matter. For me, the question is, why do the protesters dare to take risk to gathering that can potentially be infected by the COVID-19? So in the same pandemic situation that we have experienced in Indonesia, especially in Ambon City for the last few months, there are some protests in the form of the demonstration emerged, even though it has different substance compared to what happened in the US, but actually give the same implication, namely collecting many people at the same time and at the same place that cause potential spread of or transmission of the COVID-19. The same question again, why do the protesters dare to take the risk to gather within a long period of time? Meanwhile, they do know that they can potentially be infected by the COVID-19. So the courage of some social groups to carry out demonstration in the middle of pandemic situation show that there must be something wrong. Let's say the social deviation can be sourced from the government side. For example, the lack of effectiveness of government roles. On the other side, can also come from the community. For instance, problem with the knowledge and viewpoints of the society about COVID-19, or perhaps both. Okay. This is some data. Data came from survey conducted by change.org Indonesia on 24 March 2020 show that 69.6% of the community considers that the spreading of COVID-19 is a serious situation and should not be underestimated. 27.9% the situation is regarded very emergency, and only 2.5% assume that the spread of COVID-19 is not a threat, but exaggerated or hyperbolic, and only few respondents answer do not know. This data explain that 97.5% of people are convinced that the spread of COVID-19 is a very serious and an emergency situation. If we revert to the other survey conducted in Jakarta and published by one of the private TV on July the 13th, few days ago, it appears that 54% of people believe that their chance to being infected is very small. 50% of people feel that people closest to them are very likely to be infected. And even 42% also feel very small for people in the neighborhood of the resident exposed to COVID-19. In East Java, Jawa Timur, data published by the same private TV at the same day explained that the first phase survey conducted by Faculty of Public Health, Universitas Airlangga, from 4 to 8 May 2020 show that people who went to school, campus, or course, in fact, 84.6% of them didn't use mask, and 90.6% didn't maintain physical distance. At the same phase, people who went to traditional market, it found 81.6% of them didn't use mask, and 85.9% didn't maintain physical distance. At the second phase survey, executed from 19 to 23 May 2020, we noted that 75.7% of people went to school, campus, or course didn't use mask, and 86.0% didn't maintain physical distance. Furthermore, people who went to traditional market were found 84.1% didn't use mask. Meanwhile, 89.3% didn't maintain physical distance. Meanwhile, in Ambon, my colleagues have been conducting online surveys since 14 till and still open until 24th of July, tomorrow. Data on July 17 temporarily show that 84.71% of the people considers that COVID-19 as a dangerous and very dangerous pandemic situation. Therefore, 81.29% assume that implementing the health protocol is important. It is also known that 96.82% convey its willingness to comply with any of government's recommendation toward COVID-19. So, referring to the public knowledge about the spread of COVID-19, as I mentioned formally, then the question are, why the knowledge of society, of the grassroots level, about the spread of COVID-19 seems not in the same line with their attitude and behavior. Why do the people at the grassroots level have their own reason, which is different to the reason of government or local government and elites have? Why does social disobedience toward the effort in handling COVID-19 happen? These are some important questions which is interesting to be addressed in today's discussion, I guess. In relation to what I call as a social disobedience in Ambon, there are a few cases shown by some members of society that can be listed, such as abandonment of health protocols by intention. For example, not using masks or not maintaining physical distance. They refused and didn't want to conduct a rapid test, refused quarantine or fled from quarantine, show undisciplined or disobedient to stay at home, rejected the funeral of the corpse that was indicative and positive COVID-19, or forcefully took the corpse that indicated positive COVID-19. And of course, the demonstration organized by some groups of people to question certain policies related to the current pandemic situation. In Ambon, there are numbers of protests against public policies, such as protests against the community activities restriction, PKM, and large-scale social restriction policy, PSBB. And ironically, this protest was done in the middle of increasing number of infected people. Amazingly, they did the protest or demonstration in the form of assemble and show fearless about any possibility of infection by COVID-19. Protest as a form of disobedience toward the policy of Ambon city government, I think, started from the implementation of mayor regulation, commonly called Perwali or Peraturan Wali Kota number 16, 2020, about the restriction on person activities, business activities, and transportation mode in the handling of COVID-19 in Ambon. For example, the protest is organized by city transport drivers who questioned the operation policy for public bus, which is instructed should be based on oath or even license plate. This policy was regarded unpleasant one for the drivers, of course, because they had been asked to restrict their passengers previously. Similarly, the rejection also came from people of Lehitu Peninsula, the Central Maluku Regency. According to them, the Perwali or mayor regulation would potentially turn off their economic activities. So protest is also done by market traders who protest the market operation time, which is permitted only open from 5:30 AM to 4 PM, while Indomaret and Alfamidi can be regarded as a middle scale store. Yeah. Indomaret and Alfamidi are allowed to open until 8 PM, and some of those are allowed to open 24 hours. When the large-scale social restriction or PSBB was implemented since 22 of June, there was still a protest that asked for alleviating the activities of society, especially economic activity in the market. Even before the end of the PSBB, the protest was happened again to ask for consideration in order that the PSBB not to be extended. Well, from the point of protester mentioned earlier, actually we might see that beside economic factor that can be regarded as a dominant driving force in encouraging protest activities in the middle of pandemic situation, I think that sense of discrimination and injustice should be taken into account as well. In Ambon case, for example, the sense of discrimination and injustice manifested in protesters' point of view when they argued about the operation time of market compared to Indomaret and Alpha Midi. Another factor is the communication in which the message of what has been done by the government is not properly received by the public, which is in turn causing public distrust emerge. For example, the public view that COVID-19 is a project that provides economic benefits for officials and so forth. Yeah, my point is public distrust can also be a crucial factor in encouraging demonstration. This is where the intersection between the protests committed against the death of George Floyd in all over the world and the protests committed in Ambon, both in the middle of pandemic situation. The lesson we learned from those cases between the US and Ambon, or even in Netherlands, is that people will consolidate themselves in order to face what they see as discrimination and injustice, regardless if it is true or not, of course. But it was the way that they saw all the things happen. It seems that they have their own reason, created from their personal experiences, and so forth. Secondly, for me, it seems that social disobedience in the form of protest that occur in current pandemic situation is also related to communication problem. A lot of information arrive at the hand of people, yeah, who are experiencing interference either intentionally or accidentally. So the result is that society responds to what is temporarily ongoing according to what they know, so that it often leads to protest. Furthermore, for me, it also seems that the public will be obedient to whatever the government advocates for prevention of COVID-19, as long as their sense of justness is not disturbed. But when they feel discriminatory and injustice, then obedience, even in the situation of pandemic that endangers human life, is quite possible will be turned into social disobedience. Thank you.
Thank you for that, Professor Pariela. I think it was a very interesting and perspective of how COVID-19 is becoming an obstacle for protesters, and how your presentation actually directly contrasts with Professor Steijlen's presentation, and how COVID-19 heightens the protest in the Netherlands. So thank you for that, Professor. Before we actually continue to our last but not least speaker, I would like to remind the participants of two things. Firstly, for everyone, feel free to write your questions in the chat. You feel free to use Bahasa or English. All our speakers are open to the questions in any language. Secondly, the international office staff will now send the link to the attendance list for the participators. So do not forget to input your name into that link. So now we would like to introduce our last, but definitely not least, speaker, Mr. Rory Akiwen. Mr. Rory Akiwen is the Dean of Faculty of Law, Pattimura University. He studied civil law at Pattimura University for his bachelor degree. In 2014, he got his doctorate degree from civil law at Hasanuddin University. As a professional in the field of civil law, he is actively involved in several workshops as a speaker and also plays his role as an expert witness for the community dedication. Before we give the time and place to Mr. Rory, I'd like to also point out that Mr. Rory will present his presentation in Bahasa. However, we are assured that his presentation will be in English. So for our international participants, do not worry. All the information will be on the slide. And if you have any further questions, please feel free to write it in the chat and we'll have a further discussion later on. So to Mr. Rory Akiwen, the time is yours.
Thank you, Ms. Agnes. Sorry, I speak Indonesian. I hope you all can understand it. And in my opinion, the use of language is also part of human rights. I was assisted by Mrs. Foni, an international legal expert. Yang terhormat Rektor Universitas Pattimura, Profesor Fridus Sabteno, SMH, para narasumber, Master Steijlen maupun Prof. Tony. Di hari ini presentasi kami atau saya dengan judul Konstruksi Hukum HAM di Tengah Konstatasi Universalis dan Relativis di Era Globalisasi. Peristiwa Black Lives Matter yang menimpa seorang yang bernama George Floyd ini menimbulkan berbagai gejolak, terutama di Amerika Serikat, dan bukan cuma di Amerika Serikat, tetapi dia merebak sampai ke beberapa negara di dunia. Seorang yang bernama Moore mengatakan bahwa peristiwa yang terjadi pada waktu tertentu dapat dihubungkan dengan peristiwa lain yang terjadi pada waktu yang lain dan dapat dipandang sebagai suatu rangkaian. Kutipan ini mau mengatakan kepada kita sekalian bahwa relevansi yang demikian kuat antara suatu kenyataan hidup manusia di suatu masa dan ruang hidup yang berlainan tetapi memiliki kekuatan yang besar, mempengaruhi, dan itu fakta yang tidak mungkin dapat dihindari. Peristiwa George Floyd, kenapa sampai aksi-aksi di Amerika, beberapa negara bagian yang sempat mengguncang kondisi situasi di Amerika Serikat, dan juga di beberapa negara, terutama yang kami tahu di Belanda, juga ada aksi-aksi yang sama. Nah ini dipicu oleh perasaan yang sama atau kuat yang mendorong manusia itu bersuara dan bersikap. Peristiwa BLM ini atau George Floyd ini mulai merubah pemikiran kita soal konsep universalis dan konsep relativis, yang dimana keduanya berbeda, tapi pada saat di waktu-waktu tertentu ada peristiwa-peristiwa pelanggaran HAM tertentu, mereka bisa satu suara, bisa satu sikap. Nah, padahal dalam konsep universal bahwa hak asasi haruslah sama di semua tempat. Hukum HAM internasional seperti kesetaraan, perlindungan, keamanan fisik, dan itu semua harus dipahami sama di semua tempat. Tetapi konsep relativis itu menolak bahwa HAM itu harus berlaku sama di semua tempat. Menurut konsep relativis, tidak ada HAM lintas budaya yang disepakati dan tidak ada budaya yang dibolehkan dipaksakan untuk dipahami dan dipraktekkan oleh negara lain. Nah ini yang pada saat peristiwa ini sangat mengganggu dua konsep ini, sehingga perlu kita kaji konstruksi hukumnya. Nah, next. Kita bicara soal konsep HAM, saya kira semua yang hadir di saat ini juga sudah tahu apa itu HAM, ada teori hukum kodrat, teori positivisme, teori relativisme, teori Marxis, dan lain-lain. Tetapi saya mau sampaikan bahwa ada fakta dan sejarah, fact and history bahwa HAM itu berawal dari Inggris. Nah, kemudian ada perang antara utara dan selatan di Amerika Serikat yang satu pihak mendukung perbudakan, yang pihak lain anti perbudakan, sehingga lahirlah deklarasi Amerika Serikat 1776. Nah, ini menggambarkan ada kesadaran individu, ada kesadaran masyarakat, di mana martabatnya sebagai manusia itu harus dijaga. Nah, kesadaran dan pemahaman tentang nilai-nilai asas-asas yang kemudian dimanifestasikan dalam kaidah yang termuat di dalam HAM masing-masing negara. Tetapi perlu dicatat bahwa deklarasi independence Amerika Serikat kemudian dilanjutkan dengan Declaration of Human Rights, itu tidak bisa dipaksakan untuk seluruh manusia atau seluruh negara, karena masing-masing punya punya perbedaan dalam menyikapi persoalan-persoalan HAM. Nah, perkembangan, kita berikutnya kita melihat bahwa ada perkembangan generasi HAM. Nah, generasi pertama itu menunjukkan bahwa hak-hak disebut negatif, artinya tidak boleh ada campur tangan pihak lain, termasuk negara dan kekuatan sosial lainnya. Nah, generasi pertama di dalam HAM itu dibilang kenapa negatif, karena di situ melarang ada campur tangan negara, melarang ada campur tangan organisasi atau kelompok-kelompok tertentu. Nah, pada dia berkembang pada generasi kedua, itu dia merujuk kepada hak-hak ekonomi, sosial, dan budaya. Nah, di sini hak-hak ini pun dibilang hak-hak positif karena itu membutuhkan campur tangan negara. Negara butuh campur tangan dalam pemenuhan hak-hak ekonomi dari warga negaranya, hak-hak sosial dari warga negaranya. Misalnya hak atas pendidikan, hak atas pekerjaan. Generasi ketiga yaitu hak solidaritas atau hak bersama. Hak ini diilhami oleh situasi dan kondisi di wilayah selatan dan Afrika. Nah, perkembangan ini kalau kita lihat dengan dalam era globalisasi, nah kita lihat bahwa konsep-konsep yang sementara kita pelajari ini kita akan melihat bahwa dalam beberapa kasus sebetulnya bukan cuma kasus source Floyd, bukan hanya soal yang disampaikan oleh Mr. Steijlen soal Jan Pieterszoon Koen. Nah, kenapa orang-orang selalu berdemo di tempat-tempat strategis di mana mungkin di Belanda patung Jan Pieterszoon Koen itu dianggap sebagai seorang hero. Tetapi bagi orang Indonesia yang pernah mengalami katakanlah sebuah peristiwa yang dilakukan oleh Jan Pieterszoon Koen dan teman-teman, ini bukan hero, tetapi dia adalah seorang yang dianggap bahwa dia tidak layak disebut hero oleh para pendemo. Rasialisme, perbedaan warna kulit. Nah, ini kan sebetulnya kita lihat ada kasus-kasus di Indonesia. Kenapa peristiwa penghinaan oleh sekelompok orang atau seseorang di Pulau Jawa terhadap masyarakat atau sekelompok saudara-saudara atau orang-orang dari Papua. Nah, ada lebih baik kita menganut sistem perbedaan warna kulit atau perbedaan ras yang terbuka. Masih teringat dalam benak kita di Afrika Selatan. Itu bagaimana dengan apartheid langsung memisahkan kulit putih dan kulit hitam. Itu sistemnya terbuka. Tetapi kalau sistemnya tertutup, itu dia tidak kelihatan, tetapi sangat berbahaya. Source Floyd itu hanya satu kasus yang sebetulnya sudah ada beberapa kasus yang kalau menurut dugaan saya itu sudah terjadi di kalangan warga kulit hitam di Amerika Serikat. Hanya dengan munculnya kasus Source Floyd maka itu tetap dia muncul lagi. Nah, ini yang sebetulnya perlu kita sikapi bahwa di era seperti ini apakah konsep-konsep universal, konsep-konsep relativis itu dia masih tetap berjalan dengan perbedaan-perbedaan yang sangat tajam, ataukah di kondisi tertentu kedua konsep ini bisa menyatu. Nah, itu bisa dilihat bahwa sekalipun keduanya itu berbeda, Tetapi dalam kondisi-kondisi tertentu ada peristiwa-peristiwa pelanggaran HAM tertentu di mana orang sudah tidak lagi mengatakan bahwa ini konsep universal, ini konsep relativis, tetapi orang hanya bilang bagaimana pengakuan terhadap martabat atau hak-hak sipil atau hak-hak asasi dari seseorang, sekelompok orang, masyarakat maupun negara itu perlu diperhatikan. Nah, sehingga terkait dengan Black Lives Matter ini ada beberapa isu yang sebetulnya bisa saya sampaikan. Yang pertama, apakah yang dilakukan para demonstran itu benar? Yang kedua, apa dasar pembenarannya? Yang ketiga, di mana dapat ditemukan sumber hukumnya? Berikutnya, mengapa negara lain turut menyikapi peristiwa rasisme dan melakukan demo di negaranya? Apakah penerapan konsep universal ataukah relativis HAM yang digunakan dalam menyikapi peristiwa BLM yang sudah tadi saya katakan bahwa bisa terjadi keduanya bersatu. Pendukung-pendukung atau yang mendukung kedua konsep yang semula berbeda secara substansi, tetapi mungkin dengan peristiwa BLM ini mereka akan bersatu untuk bisa katakanlah memperjuangkan hak-hak yang dilanggar. Nah, yang berikutnya, apakah para demonstran dapat dituntut secara hukum dan bagaimana seharusnya negara menyikapi peristiwa tersebut? Indonesia menyikapi peristiwa-peristiwa rasisme, terutama orang-orang Papua maupun juga orang-orang non Papua, karena dalam pemahaman masyarakat bahwa hitam itu jelek, black is bad, yang putih beautiful, manis, white is beautiful. Nah, tapi ini yang harus kita sikapi di siang, pagi dan sore ini dalam sebuah webinar agar kita bisa mendapatkan beberapa pikiran-pikiran yang baik sehingga peristiwa rasisme ini tidak lagi bisa saya tidak mengatakan bahwa dia akan hilang seluruhnya. Tidak mungkin selama dunia ini masih manusia ini bisa masih hidup, rasisme itu tetap ada. Hanya dia dalam bentuk yang tertutup. Sekali lagi saya tegaskan, bentuk tertutup itu sangat berbahaya. Saya kira itu aja. Thank you, Miss Agnes. Itu aja.
Thank you for that, Mr. Rory Akiwen. Maybe a brief summary of what he has just said. The bulk of the material was about how there are two main concepts in international law, universalism and relativism, and how universalism actually talks about a universal or general idea of human rights that is accepted by many. But however, those universal rights was actually pioneered by the West, whilst many people, especially in the eastern side of the world, Asians in this context, are more likely to accept relativist perspective on human rights. And in Mr. Rory's presentation, he talks about how we need to find actually a intersection between the two, how the understanding of human rights must be based on universal general concepts that everyone must be respected as humans equally. However, the application of human rights must be applied based on the region or based on the country, and that's where we find the intersection between both those concepts. And I do hope that the participants are going to engage with this general concept and maybe discuss further with Mr. Rory and Ms. Yvonne. So thank you for that, Mr. Rory. The topics today were very engaging, which leads us all to our next session, which is our question and answer session. Like I've explained earlier, all questions will be delivered through the chat feature, and I will read them out to our speakers. I think we already have some questions that our participants have sent. Our actually first question is from Tamalia Alishabana. Their question is, what Ananias Sony Jolner says is very interesting. The orang kaya who said those words was Kalin Bakar, who was a Eurasian, and he said, "Gentlemen, have you no compassion?" Which is in essence what George Floyd was saying, "I can't breathe." So perhaps the statue of Kern should not be torn down, but on the pedestal be carved the history of the terrible massacre, including Cullen Barker's question, and that is, in this year where George Floyd pleaded to be allowed to breathe, the people of Banda say that the statue be kept to remind people of the importance of compassion. As Mita Alwi says, to be kind or to one another. In that way, a statue celebrating colonialism and the perpetrator of a massacre changes to a statue about compassion. I think this is a very meaningful passage that Tamalia has sent into the chat. Thank you. I think we need to find the next question. Next, okay. Where's the, okay, from Miss Orfensi from International Office. She opens with, in Jan Peters Zoonkun's hands were attached to the blood of the Banda Islands massacre for the sake of monopolizing nutmeg and cloves. Consent 2,000 expeditionary personnel to crush the residents of the Banda Islands in 1621, who defied the VOC ban by selling their crops to English and Portuguese traders. Around 15,000 Banda residents were killed at the time. After the residents of Banda were exhausted, Kern bought citizens from the Netherlands to cultivate nutmeg and clove plantations, employing slaves. At that time, Banda was the only place in the world where nutmeg grew. She says, who controls Banda? He holds the monopoly. Her question in this, from this reference is, when the world faces anti-racism, racism victims in Indonesia face long prison terms. Many Papuan Lives Matter campaigns and hashtags have been trending on Twitter for days and are used with Black Lives Matter. Wanting to call that there have been violations of human rights, what do you think about the fulfillment of human rights in relation to violations of civil rights of the community? How the state's responsibility and protection against this? I think this question is very general. I invite if Professor Steijlen would maybe give his insight on the question on Papuan Lives Matter movement in Indonesia. Professor Steijlen, the time is yours.
Thank you. You want me to only respond on this one or the other one that you mentioned, because it came from about the statue, because I think it's an important one. But let me first about the question of reference about the Papua Lives Matter. I think it's also addressed in a way by Pa Rory, because he in his talk he says that he said that the idea of black is bad and white is beautiful also in Indonesia, and he also referred to Papuans and the position of Papuans and the recent movements in Indonesia. And I think it's in a way a duty of all nations and its governments, but also populations, to think and look in the mirror in which way we are thinking about our fellow citizens, because it's and that's something that I learned in the Netherlands without knowing, and it's what I was talking about when I was talking about this cultural archive. Without knowing, you have these ideas about differences between races or between color and between people, and we act according to them. And I think it's to get a better society, it's always very important to look into the mirror and to be honest to yourself and find out. And it's like in the Netherlands when we have a discussion about racism or about institutional discrimination or racism, white people always are a kind of reacting that they say, you're saying I'm a racist, which means that they have all these ideas about differences in race. And in fact, that's not what the discussion is about. The discussion is about all the non-conscious things that are going on in our minds and determines how we react and how we respond to other people. And I think it's very good to do a kind of introspective, and that's something that we have to do almost every day. So I think it's an important issue raised by Rory and by reference. Let me take the opportunity to go to the other question, because I saw chats coming by and the remark of Sonny and Mita Alwi, somebody referred to the an interview with Mita Alwi in the Observer of today. And it's about the statue. Sonny also said a little bit earlier in the chat room, he said, he asked, what do you think is the statue not representing a domination of race over other races because of political and economic interests? So what he in fact says is that putting Coen on this pedestal, and especially the way that he is his statue language, like everybody who passes by should be kind of humble. It's putting a specific person on the pedestal. I think for a lot of Moluccans in the Netherlands, when they go to the center of the city of Hoorn, they feel that it's the white person that was already oppressing in 1621 still there, and we have to acknowledge his superiority. So this is always also a point. Then the idea of putting a plaquette, there's already a plaquette, but adding more information, I think it's good. But if we would just put information on the lower level of the pedestal, then the black pages of the history and the agency or the victims are still under the lower than this supreme superiority of this white person standing at the top. So I think you have to really think about how you are going to manage that. Shouldn't it be another kind of statue that expresses more the position of the people of Banda? The comparison that was made also by several people in the chat room, that and what you just read about gentlemen, do you have compassion? Which is a kind of similar request for survival in 1621, which is compared with the George Floyd. I think there's a key of showing what was happening. So I'm not sure if we are going to rewrite the window of what happened in Banda in 1621, that we should have the figurehead of the J.P. Coen. Maybe we should have another figurehead. But at the same time, I agree that we should tell this story, because if we take it out and we stop and we are silent about what happened, then we are losing history. So that's something that we have to find a good solution. And I think that's why it's very important that people from Banda, like Mita Alwi, but also other people, not just from the Netherlands, involved in how should we tell this story, this window of history.
Thank you for that, Professor. We saw that Professor Steijlen actually responded to the comments that I read beforehand, so thank you for that. I would like now to give the opportunity to Professor Pariela, maybe to respond the same comments that we found in the chat, or even answer the previous question that Ms. Referency sent from the International Office about state obligation. So to Professor Pariela, the time is yours.
I have brief comments on specific question, because many question is directed to Professor Steijlen. So in relation to the question raised by from Dispar, she asked about the strategy, government strategy to restore the public distrust. I think the government should create a kind of, let's say, clearinghouse that can be used to make clearance of many distortion distortion information. In relation to this idea, I think strengthening the community is very important. The clearinghouse can be built in within a community, so it can be used as a mechanism, clearance mechanism, in order to make information come from a government to society become clear. So they people can receive information clearly. I think this is my brief comment on question raised by I forgot, someone from this part or something. Thank you. Agnes?
Thank you for that, Professor. It was very insightful. Before we actually continue with the second question, which was from Mr. Fancy, I think there's actually a extension of that statement from the previous phrase, and that's about how third and fourth generation of Moluccans in the Netherlands living their legacy. How important is the history and their roots in their life? This also leads to my curiosity about the multicultural life in the Netherlands. Please explain about Moluccans' position among many multicultural groups in the Netherlands. This is from Elizabeth Diane. And before Mr. Rory actually continues with his answer, I think it's important for us to actually answer this question because it directly correlates with what Professor Steijlen said before. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. And I think this is also connected to a question of Steve Gaspers from UKIM. What can we learn from multi-ethnicity and multi-ethnic societies in the Netherlands, also for Maluku? I think when I look into the Zoom meeting, there are other people who can talk about this issue better than me, because they are Moluccans from the Netherlands. But let me try to say something. There are different ways in which the third and fourth, but also the second generation of Moluccans in the Netherlands were dealing with their legacy and their history and their position in the Netherlands. And it depends on. So there are different ways. There are people who are really. Oh, something's happening. There are people who are very much. I'm still there or no? Okay. Agnes, what's happening?
Someone should stop the sharing.
Sharing.
Yeah.
Somebody shares the. Okay. So it depends on, there are different people, there are different ways of dealing with the legacy. There are people like, for example, Building the Baleo, one of the organizers of the demonstration in Hoorn, who are very much into finding the Adat and the more original culture of Maluku, which is, I think, a kind of primordial approach, but it's a way of dealing with with your legacy. We see that for Moluccans in the Netherlands, the specific history of Orang Maluku in Banda is very important for identity, because that makes them, so beside the knowledge and legacy that originates and roots in Maluku, there's also this important part of legacy that's connected to the history in the Netherlands, because that makes them Moluccans in the Netherlands and makes them different from other groups in the Netherlands. So for a lot of Moluccans in the Netherlands to know more about the way how the decolonization was, why Moluccans came to the Netherlands and how they were treated by the Dutch government, is of very much importance for their identity and their legacy, because that makes them different from, for example, Surinamese who came, a large group came after 1975 when Suriname became independent, and who have a lot of them have slavery, are ancestors of slavery, people made enslaved people, but it also makes them different from, for example, Turkish or Moroccan people who are descendants of people of laborers who were brought to the Netherlands and to Europe because the Dutch and the Europeans didn't want to do the dirty work anymore. So I think there are some differences. At some point, we see that these different ethnic groups are cooperating, that they are united in their goals and interests, and sometimes we see that they bounce, and this depends on specific topics. For example, in periods where there's a strong attention around religion, for example, after the 9/11, we see that a lot of focus is shifted to the Moroccan and the Turkish people because they are the Muslim minorities in the Netherlands. At this moment, when we look at for example, the Black Lives Matter movement in the Netherlands, there are some debates because the word black and decolonizing society is in a kind politicized. So when we talk about black, it's not about just color, but it's also about position, and it's about political awareness. And then we see that there are some groups who say, I'm not black, I'm not, because I don't want to be fully identified with the descendants of, for example, the Surinamese, the descendants of the slave. So the multi-ethnicity and the cooperation varies very much over time and in different aspects. But I think it's interesting to discuss and to also to discuss between Maluku and the Netherlands, because a part of this multi-ethnicity in the Netherlands are people from Maluku. And what's important that people are organizing their own activities and initiatives to keep and to preserve the legacy, like the Maluku Historical Museum, but also this what I already told, the building, the Baleo, in which they partly work on this, let's say, this platform in the Netherlands, and at the same time in the platform in connection with Maluku. It's not a full answer, but I think it's something that's like a starting. And I remember that I promised Steve to talk with him about doing something at UKIM.
Thank you for that, Professor. And I think now we'll continue with Mr. Fancy's question that Mr. Rory will explain the perspective of national or state obligation towards Papuan Lives Matter. The time's yours.
Thank you, Agnes. Case Papua, sebetulnya Konstitusi Indonesia sudah menjamin bahwa setiap warga negara sama di depan hukum dan pemerintahan. Nah, sehingga yang perlu dilihat adalah sikap atau kebijakan atau realisasi dari konstitusi untuk bagaimana melindungi warga negara, baik hitam, putih, kuning, apapun agamanya, itu harus sama dan semua sama di depan hukum. Kebijakan yang perlu dilakukan oleh pemerintah bagaimana hanya melaksanakan amanat dari konstitusi kita. Papua adalah Indonesia, hitam adalah Indonesia, bukan Papua di luar Indonesia, tapi Papua adalah Indonesia. Warga negara Papua hitam, keriting, Maluku juga keriting hitam, itu punya hak yang sama. Tidak ada yang beda. Nah, hanya dilihat apakah persoalan ini bisa disikapi dengan baik oleh pemerintah, sehingga perlakuan yang tadi saya katakan bahwa perlakuan untuk ada diskriminasi antara orang Papua, orang Maluku dan orang di luar itu tidak terjadi lagi. Tapi menurut saya ini tidak mungkin tidak terjadi, karena di seluruh dunia, katakanlah di Amerika, bahkan di Belanda, di Maluku, dan juga di Indonesia bahwa kita sepertinya masih menganut atau perilaku itu adalah rasialisme tertutup. Artinya masih ada perbedaan-perbedaan di dalam kehidupan keseharian kita. Nah, sehingga ini perlu disikapi dengan baik oleh pemerintah Indonesia untuk bagaimana implementasi dari konstitusi ini bisa berjalan dengan baik sehingga semua orang sama di depan hukum. Karena prinsip HAM adalah semua orang adalah sama, apapun warna kulitnya, apapun agamanya, berasal dari mana, di hadapan Tuhan itu semuanya sama. Terima kasih Bu Fensi.
Okay, thank you for that insightful response. Now I think it's time we heard a little bit on the aspect of protests in Maluku based on Professor Pariala's material. So we have a question from Kesha Lawrence for Professor Pariala. The question goes as follows: for the problem of disobedience, I think this can happen because of public distrust of government. She asks, what do you think the government's strategy to restore public trust is? To Professor Pariala, the time is yours.
Thank you. Actually, I already respond to that question. I said that formally I said that government should create a kind of a clearinghouse that can be used as a clearance mechanism in order to minimize the many distortion information. So we hope that the government might be able to create a clearinghouse institution so people might be able to have clear information. Secondly, I would like to respond to Pak Steve Aspers. Steve, I think that if we look at the participant of the demonstration, it could be possible that we may think that the demonstration has related to the situation when the conflict arose. But I think, Steve, that the demo posed community restriction or a large-scale social restriction related to segregation by place among society in Ambon. It's heavily connected to restriction in economic activity that limited their people access to do something more productive. So I think it's not related to the pattern of social segregation, especially in the last time when conflict arose. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you for that, Professor. I think to maybe add on to your answer, we actually have another question that relates directly to your previous question, which is, do you think that few mass demonstrations in Ambon recently mean the implementation of PKM or PSBB is actually more about the economic depression burdened by mostly traders in Pasar Mardika who felt threatened by the government policy to restrict their economic activities, or perhaps it was all about the segregated social communities as a residue of the past Ambon conflict? And this is from Steve from UKIM.
As I said, that if you look at the participant of the demonstration, we may come to the conclusion that it could relate it to the past situation. I mean, conflict Maluku, but I don't see that demo, especially post PKM or post PSBB, has a relation to segregation by place among society in Ambon. So for me, it is heavily connected to restriction of economic activities that limited their access, people access to do something more productive. That's all. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you for that, Professor. Before we actually move on, because there are many questions for Professor Fridus, I think we're going to let Mr. Rory answer his questions because there's a couple left. And then for the closing of this session, we're going to ask Mr. Fridus to actually answer the rest of them. So before we continue to Mr. Fridus, Professor Fridus, sorry, we have a question for Pak Rory about it's in Bahasa from Tamalia. Masalah tentang diskriminasi terhadap orang Papua bukan hanya masalah hukum. Dua alat rekayasa sosial adalah hukum dan pendidikan. Jadi pendidikan yang harus ditekan. Sejak SD harus diajar toleransi dan persamaan hak bahwa warna kulit tidak penting. Maybe this is not a question, but mungkin untuk yes, Ibu Yvonne and Pak Rory, mungkin ada tanggapan. So we're going to see their response towards this.
Pertanyaan saya Tamal. Iya. Baik. Untuk pertanyaan Saudara Tamala terkait dengan perlu penekanan aspek pendidikan dari sejak dini agar persoalan diskriminasi itu dia tidak terbawa-bawa sampai kemudian meluas ya. Nah, yang perlu kita pahami Bapak Ibu bahwa kalau kita bicara tentang universal itu, kita bicara tentang hak-hak moral, nilai-nilai moral bahwa semua orang itu memiliki martabat dan derajat yang sama. Itu standar kemanusiaan, ya. Itu standar kemanusiaan bahwa semua orang itu memiliki harkat dan martabat yang sama. Sehingga tidak ada latar belakang karena warna kulit, agama, suku, budaya, dia menjadi hal-hal yang kemudian menegasikan eksistensi harkat dan martabat manusia. Dan saya sependapat dengan apa yang disampaikan oleh Ibu Tamala bahwa pendidikan itu dia mesti menjadi dasar yang paling utama. Dan itu mesti dimulai dari dalam keluarga. Ya. Pendidikan bukan hanya pada lingkup formal, sekolah-sekolah, lembaga-lembaga pendidikan, tetapi pendidikan itu dia mesti diletakkan lebih awal di dalam keluarga tentang standar kemanusiaan bahwa semua orang itu sama di hadapan Tuhan karena itu bicara tentang nilai moral, bicara tentang harkat dan martabat manusia. Dan itu harus diletakkan dari dalam keluarga kita. Jadi jangan kita selalu berharap bahwa dunia pendidikan itu nanti kalau anak-anak kita sudah masuk lembaga pendidikan baru diajarkan tentang bagaimana menghargai dan menghormati sesama yang berbeda warna kulit, ya, agama, suku, budaya dan macam-macam. Tetapi sesungguhnya dasar-dasar itu diletakkan di tengah-tengah kehidupan keluarga sebagai basis masyarakat yang paling terkecil. Itu pendapat saya. Saya setuju, tetapi itu membutuhkan bukan hanya kita bicara, ya. Kita bukan sekedar bicara karena dalam ruang dan waktu yang sementara kita bahas sekarang ini materinya. Tetapi bagaimana pelaksanaannya itu? Pelaksanaannya itu mesti benar-benar menjadi tanggung jawab moral dari setiap individu, setiap orang tua, setiap keluarga. Dan dia keluar sampai kepada para pemimpin di tengah-tengah masyarakat, sampai juga kepada pemimpin-pemimpin di lembaga-lembaga pendidikan. Dan itu bukan hanya bicara, tetapi dia mesti teraktualisasi lewat sikap dan perilaku kita terhadap sesama yang meletakkan dia pada harkat dan martabat yang sama. Jadi kita mesti bicara dengan perbuatan itu dalam kesejajaran. Saya pikir itu yang bisa saya sampaikan. Terima kasih.
Thank you for that, Ibu Yvonne. It was very insightful to hear about how education plays a big role in actually shaping our future generations and children about actually how they face racism and how they do not become racist themselves. And she talks about how through education, and education, not only formal education, but actually in families as well, those lessons that we teach children, it will actually in turn teach a generation or society, because they are going to be the future leaders and the people who will influence others. And I think that's very insightful. On top of that, we're going to actually turn to Mr. Rory, and in comparison or in contrast to the question about education, now we're going to look on the legal aspect, or the law aspect, from Steve from UKIM again. His question is in Bahasa, so I'll read it in Bahasa. Apakah hal itu, dalam studi etnisitas, rasisme itulah yang melahirkan ras. Secara prinsipil, bahasa hukum menjamin kesetaraan identitas antar warga negara. Tapi secara politis, perspektif hukum tidak bisa dilepaskan dari siapa yang memberlakukan hukum itu. Jadi aspek kesadaran subjektif para aktor yang mempengaruhi konsep dan praktik keadilan sosial. Menurut Pak Rory, apakah hal itu juga disebabkan karena produk hukum nasional kita masih sangat didominasi oleh produk hukum masa kolonial yang diskriminatif dan rasial? Terima kasih. Time is yours, Prof.
Oke, thank you, Agnes. Mr. Steve, produk hukum nasional, produk hukum Indonesia sekarang sudah tidak lagi didominasi oleh produk hukum kolonial. Nah, karena kita sudah di Belanda pun kita contohkan ada, ya, kalau kita masih berpegang kepada KUH Perdata, di Belanda sudah ada New KUH Perdata. Jadi kita sudah tidak lagi, sebetulnya kita tidak lagi memakai produk kolonial kecuali dalam hal-hal tertentu yang pada saat masih sampai saat ini belum ada produk hukum yang menggantikannya. Tetapi amandemen konstitusi kita kan sudah berapa kali? Undang-Undang Dasar Negara Kesatuan Republik Indonesia sudah diamandemen berapa kali? Itu tandanya bahwa kita tidak lagi mewarisi produk-produk hukum dari masa kolonial. Nah, persoalannya bukan soal apakah kita masih mewarisi atau tidak. Persoalannya adalah apakah ada kemauan dari pemerintah, kemauan dari yang melaksanakan aturan ini di lapangan. Prinsipnya kan cuma satu. Dia harus melindungi segenap warga negara Indonesia dan seluruh tumpah darah Indonesia. Tetapi kenapa yang lain dilindungi, yang lain tidak dilindungi? Semua punya hak untuk mendapatkan pendidikan, semua punya hak untuk mendapatkan kesejahteraan. Tetapi kenapa harus ada perbedaan? Nah, kita lihat bahwa sebetulnya hukum dibuat bukan untuk orang-orang kaya, tetapi hukum dibuat bukan untuk orang yang bersalah, tapi untuk orang yang benar. Nah, dan ini semua sudah bisa terjawab sebetulnya. Ada beberapa kasus yang muncul, bukan cuma soal orang Papua, tapi ada kasus-kasus tertentu yang sebetulnya luput dari pantauan kita, bahwa ada sebetulnya bentuk-bentuk ketidakadilan yang kita rasakan, tetapi mungkin tidak disuarakan atau tidak diekspos. Nah, ini kembali lagi bagaimana negara bisa melaksanakan tanggung jawab sesuai dengan amanat konstitusi, bahwa dia punya tanggung jawab untuk katakanlah dengan COVID-19. Nah, bagaimana negara harus bertanggung jawab untuk menyelamatkan, bagaimana bisa membantu atau membuat sehingga masyarakat tidak lagi bisa tertular, menyiapkan semua kebutuhan-kebutuhan masyarakat, baik dari aspek pendidikan, ekonomi, dan lain-lain. Nah, jadi Mr. Steve, ini sebetulnya kembali lagi ke pemerintah dan orang-orang yang akan menerapkan aturan-aturan di masyarakat. Aturan sudah bagus, tetapi mungkin orang-orangnya yang tidak konsisten untuk melaksanakan itu. Terima kasih.
Thank you for that, Mr. Rory. I think his answer is actually a perfect segue to a question we received from Elizabeth Diane, which she asked a bit earlier, but I'm sorry I missed. Her question is regarding, colonialism and the impact in Indonesia. She states that it's still fresh in our mind, the state visit of King Willem of Netherlands to Indonesia early this year. And in his state visit, he then apologized to Indonesia for the Dutch past in Indonesia. To Professor Fridus, could you please give us a point of view about what many Dutch people think about this? Time is yours.
You mean about what the Dutch people think about the apologies by the Dutch king? Well, it's to be honest, the point is that the apologies by the Dutch king was not about colonialism. The apologies by the Dutch king was about atrocities and the violence and the severe violence that was taking place between 1945 and 1950. He said he was apologizing for the fact that the Dutch thought after 1945, after the proclamation of Indonesia and the capitulation of the Japanese, that the Dutch thought that they could come back, and that they did so by using violence. So that's, I think it's a very limited, and when we look at how in the Netherlands these excuses are discussed, and this is very complicated because there are very much people with different interests. There's one group, and that's mainly the veterans meaning Dutch military who were sent to Indonesia to try to recolonize. They feel it's like they're stabbing in the back because they said, you sent us there, we have to fight, we did it, and now you're going to apologize, so you're leaving us standing alone. Then there's the Indo-European community who left Indonesia after decolonization, after between 1945 and especially after 1950, and later after what we call the formal transfer of sovereignty. They feel that these apologies are not good because it's only apologies for Dutch violence, as they think that there is a lack of apologies by Indonesians on the violence against the European community at that time. And then there are more critical people in the Netherlands who think that these apologies are too poor because it's just about the incidents of violence between 1945 and 1950. And there are not apologies about colonialism, which is in fact the whole point when we think about the history of the Netherlands and Indonesia. So that's it basically, and I think we can organize 4 webinars to discuss these issues, and I think it should be done. But these are kind of the reactions from the Netherlands. Because we are at the moment doing a lot of research on violence between 1940 by the Dutch veterans, not Dutch veterans, by the Dutch army between 1945 and 1950. There are very heated debates in the Netherlands about our colonial past. And in fact, all these 3 perspectives that I just sketched, described, they are coming back in these debates. But I think it's important because debating these issues and not limiting these discussions to what happened between 1945 and 1950, but extended to the earlier periods, starting with, we have discussed the guy already a couple of times, Jan Pieterszoon Koen. I think it's a good thing because it's a way for the Netherlands to look into the mirror and to understand how colonialism worked, how colonialism also created the Dutch nation and created the way that we think and we look at the history and even the present day society. And I think it's important to not only do this in the Netherlands, but to do this in platforms like this webinar, where people who are also where we have the discussion with Indonesians on this history. So this is more a general description of what's happening, and I think it's an endeavor that we should undertake together. And to be honest, maybe it's most important for the Dutch society to do this together, because that's the only way that we can learn how to decolonize our own society.
Steijlen. Oh?
Thank you for that, Professor. The next question we have is from Stephanie Teria Saluteru. I think for the first question, Professor has already answered it previously quite extensively. So I think we're going to now go into the second question about her question is, I give an example now in Ambon, young Maluku people find it difficult to find a job in our country, and most people come from Java and work in Maluku. Her question is this included as racism? I think it's fair to ask, firstly, Professor Pariela, what do you think of this?
Yeah, I don't see the problem like her. I think the difficulties in finding job in Ambon, especially related to the capacity of each person. So I think the main problem in about the availability of a job in Ambon, especially relates to the investment in many fields. So if we want to create job for especially the young people, we should make them more ready to find their job properly. I mean, if they have no capacity, skills, for example, in specific field, it's quite hard to find jobs. Not in Ambon, but also in many places, I think. Thank you.
Thank you for that, Professor Pariela. Maybe to Mr. Rory or Ibu Ifan, if you have any insight on this.
Thank you, Agnes. Stephanie Sahuteru. Kalau dilihat dari konsep atau dari rasialisme tertutup, mungkin iya. Saya tidak berpendapat bahwa itu ya, tetapi kalau kita pendekatannya dari rasialisme tertutup, mungkin aja ada perbedaan. Kalau orang di luar Jawa itu mencari pekerjaan di Jawa itu agak cukup sulit. Kalau kita lihat dari pendekatan rasialisme tertutup, mungkin saya tidak mengatakan itu pasti, tetapi fakta juga membuktikan bahwa siapapun yang mau mencari pekerjaan baik di Pulau Jawa maupun di luar Pulau Jawa, bahkan di Maluku, harus ada beberapa persyaratan, terutama skill. Kita tidak bisa langsung menjudge bahwa tidak diterima karena ada Jawa dan luar Jawa. Tetapi kita harus sadar bahwa terutama rakyat Maluku atau orang-orang di Ambon, bahwa kita harus meningkatkan skill individu sehingga kita bisa bersaing kompetisi dengan yang lain. Jadi jangan menjudge bahwa tidak diterima karena hanya khusus untuk orang Jawa atau orang di luar Pulau Jawa. Lalu kita menjudge bahwa ini rasis atau dia masuk dalam kategori perbedaan, itu jangan seperti itu. Nah, jadi sekali lagi saya katakan kalau dari konsep rasialisme tertutup mungkin ya, maybe ya, yes. Tapi kalau kita lihat faktanya bahwa yang dibutuhkan sekarang adalah yang punya skill, kemampuan untuk bisa bersaing dan bekerja. Saya kira itu dari saya. Terima kasih.
Thank you for that, Mr. Rory. Maybe a brief summary of that in English for Stephanie. What Mr. Rory actually said is that from the basic definition of racism, he doesn't think that we can actually say that it is racism, but from the aspect of closed racism or even institutionalized racism, maybe it could be defined as racism when the youth of Maluku go to Java to find a job and they are unable, but in return, the Javanese come to Maluku and they are easily able to get a job. And he actually talks about how we cannot actually look at that from the aspect of racism, but the aspect of meritocracy. And they're actually skills that are needed in the field. They are being filled by Javanese workers who are coming to Maluku. So he says the solution to this is not only erasing racism, but he actually says the main solution is to maybe increase the skill of the people in Maluku, if that answers your question. We're going to ask a couple of last questions. I'm sorry that we cannot ask them all. It's been a pleasure to see everyone's enthusiasm, but time is very limited. So we're going to go next to Ron Habibo's question. He has a couple, and I think it's to Professor Steijlen, and he talks about to what extent have the Bandanese preserved their original culture, and what has been the impact on the life of the surviving Bandanese? I assume in context to JP Coen. To Professor, time is yours.
Thank you. I think Ron says this is one of the issues that we should discuss, and we have to, and probably have to do more research on. For a long time, when people were talking about what happened in 1621, the idea was all the people on Banda were killed, and then suddenly people, but wait a minute, in Southeast Maluku, there are still descendants of the people from Banda. Don't forget that they are still there, and they kind of preserve their legacy. If we understand, if we talk about what happened, it's not only we should not only stick to the violent moment or the oppressor or the perpetrator, but we also should think about what happened with the people who were at that point victim, and not see them just as a victim, because they also have agency by fleeing and by keeping their identity for a longer period. So this is about people at that point fleeing. Then of course there are the Bandanese who came after Jan Pieterszoon Coen did his massacre, the Perkiniers. So they created, there's a new kind of Bandanese community emerged. And also that's what we have to think about, and we have to discuss. And not only how they preserve their legacies, but also about how their lives was changed, like how they continued living in Southeast Maluku, and how they kept the memory and their history, because history is part of your identity. So I think it's an important point that Ron is making, that we have to also discuss that. And I think it connects in a way with the point that I try to make, that we should discuss not only discuss the window of 1621, not just only with the figurehead Coen, but also together with the people from Banda and the people who were involved at that time. And I think I saw some of the other chats of Ron saying, why is always talking about and not with? And I think that's the point that we should make. Yeah.
Okay, thank you for that, Professor. We have one last question, but before I read that question, I just want to tell everyone that after this, we will share a email address so that you can forward the questions to the international office, and then we will forward all these questions to Professor Steijlen, so that he may respond to them if he can. Personally. So our last question for today's session is from Limdia Oktora. Her question is, despite Indonesian complexity in terms of multi-ethnicity, multicultural society, broad geography, religion, and population, Indonesia is guided by its constitutional principles of unity in diversity, or Pancasila. Maluku has what we call Pela, which Pela calls brotherhoods and Indonesian heroes of the past that we have include Ki Hajar Dewantara, Ing Madiamang Unkarso, and Tutburi Hadiani. Then what could be the core issues of the root causes that increase tension between the internal community in Maluku? And for this, I asked Prof. Pariela to give his insight on this question.
Yeah, thank you. Of course, Maluku or Ambon, basically,
Of the root causes
sorry?
causes that tension
Okay,
between.
sorry. The question was about the relation between Pela and our Indonesian heroes, and how they asked about what could be the core issues of the root causes that increased tensions between the internal community in Maluku.
Yes, of course, Pela. Pela is a very important institution that we have in Maluku. Pela relationship can function to bring all different people from different background come together, sit together, and talk face to face. So I mean that the Pela can be regarded as an institution that can be a central institution to be a bridge for many community with different background, different background of religious background or ethnicity background and so forth. So in that sense, I think that the concept of unity in diversity is very famous and can be found in everyday life of people in Ambon. So in the future, we should keep to strengthening the Pela relationship in order to keep the unity in diversity, and that's why we want to propose that the Pela or Gandong should be strengthening all the time, and the government should pay attention in order to give more facilitation, for example, so the warming up the Pela or Gandong can be executed every time regularly. Thank you.
Thank you for that, Professor Pariela. And with that, we conclude our question and answer session. We thank you. We thank everyone who had sent questions, and we apologize as well that we weren't able to ask all of them. We have already sent the link. Have we sent? After this, we will send the link for the email address in the chat function so that we can connect you to our speakers so that you may ask more. But because this session was very tough and very emotionally draining for some, and also filled with lots of information, I think it's fair to say we are all looking for some ice breaking maybe. So in this session, I would like to introduce the International Office University Pattimura staff and their ice-breaking presentation, and they will sing a song. So I hope everyone enjoys that.
Pensi Balagwe. Pensi Balagwe.
No sound, Agnes?
Wow, thank you very much for that fantastic rendition of Sio Maluku and beautiful poem. It definitely boosted my spirit, and I'm very sure it boosted many of the participants' spirits as well. And I hope it offers a little sense of nostalgia for our fellow Malukuns. Yes. So to conclude today's discussion, I invite all the speakers to give a short conclusion, maybe a minute closing statement. And first of all, I'd like to invite Mr. Rory Akiwen to give the closing statement.
Thank you, Miss Agnes. Hak asasi manusia tetap bermasalah selagi kehidupan ini masih ada. Indonesia punya ideologi Pancasila. Kalau di Indonesia kita mau meminimalisir persoalan-persoalan seperti yang tadi saya ungkapkan, berarti kita harus kembali lagi ke zaman di mana kita mengamalkan nilai-nilai Pancasila. Pengamalan dari nilai-nilai Pancasila itu menurut saya dia meminimalisir persoalan-persoalan rasisme. Kenapa? Karena di dalam nilai-nilai Pancasila itu ada toleransi, Ada penghargaan terhadap harkat dan martabat manusia, ada penghargaan terhadap hak-hak hidup dari setiap manusia di Indonesia bahkan di dunia. Untuk itu kami berharap bahwa sekalipun konsep HAM selalu berbeda pendapat, selalu berbeda, tetapi martabat manusia kita harus junjung tinggi, dan marilah kita bersatu untuk meminimalisir persoalan-persoalan yang bukan cuma source point, tetapi persoalan-persoalan di lingkungan kita, di negara kita, bahkan di dunia. Terima kasih.
Thank you for that, Mr. Rory. I now invite Professor Tony to deliver his closing statement. Time is yours, Professor.
Thank you. In my closing statement, I would like to say that social disobedience can be happen anytime, anywhere, depending on how people understand or interpret the objective reality that they have been facing with. If they experience something that is perceived by them as indiscrimination, injustice, racist, then the social disobedience can potentially occur in the form of demonstration or protest movement. I think that's all. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Pariela. And to close our closing statements, I invite Professor Steijlen to deliver his closing statement.
Yes, thank you. First, I want to observe that I really enjoyed this webinar and a very good moderating and contributions of everybody. And I saw it coming through the chats a couple of times, but it's something that's really coming from my heart. This is, I think, what we should do more often. Then maybe to the topic, although it seems that some of the talks were at some points a little bit more of distance, I think there's a lot of connection. But Tony is talking about disobedience. And like he just said, that if you see disobedience, people not respecting regulations, you should always think about what is the topic that they are putting on the agenda. And I think that's it was something that I explained. The people, when they started to demonstrate, could not keep this 1.5 meter distance in the Netherlands. They were putting on the agenda a very important issue, being racism, anti-colonialism, or the colonial period, and the present day institutional racism. And that deals with the human rights, where Rory was talking about. Something that we have to take into account and respect every day and think about every day. So I think there's a huge connection that says that we have to look at these movements from all kind of these different perspectives to understand the movements, but also to learn about the message of these movements and the actions of people, because that's a part of what I said, looking in our mirror and try to rewrite how we see our past through windows on history. And I think that's when I was talking about figureheads, and I had to think about it again when Rory said, if you think about J.P. Coen in the Netherlands, he's a hero. In Indonesia, the meaning of J.P. Coen is different. And I think talking about these differences, and I can assure Rory that not everybody in the Netherlands, luckily, considers J.P. Coen to be a hero. There are cukup banyak orang yang tidak setuju dengan dia pahlawan atau dia hero, but that's the discussions that we should have, because we are rewriting, and we have to think and rethink about how we want to write and tell our history through the position of the present. One of the chats said, connecting history to today, that's making colonialism into compassion, and that's something that's very good. I would add something. I think it's not connecting history to today, but we should think about history from today. History should be important for what we are doing today. And the only way to make it more than just colonialism or post-colonialism is to do this rewriting together, like Ron said and several other people said, not just about, but with each other. And I think one of the things that we did today in this webinar is start this position and this discussion about thinking about the history together from this different kind of perspectives. And I think this was a very good step today. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Steijlen. It was a fantastic note to end our discussion on for today. I also want to thank our three speakers today, Professor Steijlen, again, Professor Pariala, and Mr. Akiwan. It was a very insightful and informative discussion. I think most of the information and the messages that we learned throughout this, the presentations and the question and answer session, I think many of those statements and answers resonated with many of the participants today as, learners or academically or even emotionally as maybe Moluccans or even Bandanese people. So I think it was as much as it was informative, I think it was very emotional for everyone as well. Before I hand this this webinar back to Ms. Wilma, I'd like to actually thank everyone for everyone's participation, and I'd like to actually apologize if I've said or done anything that has offended anyone in any way as your moderator today. But before that, I actually got some information that we had some technical difficulties regarding the ice breaking. So I think there's still a lot of ice that still needs to be broken. So we're actually going to ask the International Office for staff, International Office to actually share the video of the ice breaking. So the ice may be broken. To the International Office. Yes. Okay, please enjoy.
Minta bakti Raja Wani ini sama minta bakti Raja Wani ketika lahir dibawakan datuk dan sampan. Minta bakti Raja Wani menjaga hutan pala, minta api di pangkai syawal. sunyi enggak benar. Menurut beta tifa, pohon pala, badan perawat dari hidup sampai bertiba. Mari menari, mari berlian, mari berlomba. Awas, jangan bikin beta marah, beta bikin kepala mati gadis kaku, beta tiring. Beta ada di siang, di rumah gangga, dan api membakar pulau. Beta mati kejauhan yang dijaga dan tidak cuma satu. Pasir putih berniur yang seperti bidadari yang
Thank you for that lovely rendition, International Office of Unpati. So again, I'd like to say thank you for this opportunity as your moderator. I really appreciate everyone's very direct participation. I'm sorry, am I audible?
One can hear me?
Can everyone hear me?
Yeah. Yes.
Okay, thank you. Sorry for that. So without further ado, to end this webinar, I will hand over this webinar back to Ms. Wilma. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Nice presentation and also moderating. Dear speakers and audiences, we turn into the photo session. As the agenda states, the picture will be captured by admin. So we request you, please hold your position and admin will capture your picture by snipping tools. Please, admin. One, two, three. Change to another slide. Please, admin. One, two, three.
Yes. Yeah. Once again, please. 1, 2, and 3. Okay. Thank you very much for your post. Back to the MC.
Okay, thank you. Now we almost turn to the end of this webinar and we will have a closing speech by our rector. I invite Professor Dr. M.J. Sapteno SHM to deliver his closing speech. To Professor Sapteno, the time is yours. Thank you.
I think the webinar is very important for our Pattimura University, especially for lecturer and student and all staff and the order. And I hope we will make a webinar in the order time. And I think all staff to follow it. And on behalf Pattimura University leader, I would like to say thank you very much for all participants, especially for the speaker, the all speaker, especially for Professor Fridus. Waiting for you and your family in Holland, and I hope you are peace in Holland, and all the people in Holland is life in situation peace, like we are in Ambon. And thank you very much for all participants, and I hope the other time we will make the webinar and other title. Thank you for all participants.
Thank you, Prof. Thank you, Prof. Sapteno. So this is the end of the webinar two held by International Office Pattimura University. Once again, I would like to say thank you to all speakers. First of all, Professor Dr. Fridus Steijlen, Professor Dr. Tony Parila MA, Dr. Treji Akuen SHMH, and Agnes as a moderator, and Ibu Yvonne, who has been willing to participate in this online webinar by giving very important and beneficial material for us. We hope the audience could get the beneficial knowledge today, and we will send you the certificate, which has been signed by our rector and Professor Steijlen through your email address. Thank you very much for staying with us until the end of online webinar. We hope we could meet you in the next session webinar series 3, held by International Office University of Pattimura. And I wish you a very good day and good evening from Ambon to Holland. Bye-bye. Thank you. Thank you, Prof. Steijlen.
Thank you for organizing. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Prof. Steijlen.
Thank you, Tony. We have to discuss the follow-up of the MOU, I think.
Of course, I'm waiting for you in Ambon, or you are waiting for me in Holland. Yeah.
Yes.
We have problem.
We are disturbed, yes. But
Yeah.
thank you, Prof. Sapteno, for signing the MOU, because it's...
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, we will keep in touch.
Yeah. If you have an idea, please write me, Prof. Steijlen.
Yeah, I will do.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Pak Mus, sampai ketemu lagi.
Ya. Salam hormat untuk semua di Holland.
Yeah, I will do. Thank you.
Selamat.
Ya, Ibu.
Thank you so much.
Makasih. Besok datang, Ibu.
Nanti